Welcome to a special YouTube and District of Conservation broadcast fresh off the heels of the 2024 election. And no better person to speak about energy in particular than my friend, past IWF predecessor and mentor and energy wonk, Mandy Gunasekara. Mandy, it's so great to catch up with you. I know you were just in DC. We weren't able to catch up because you've been busy like a bee. And just reading your insight into what happened and how energy is kind of not really in the top scope of things, but it is back of mind for people. Energy largely did get hamstrung and worsened because of inflation, all this government spending, this tax and spend policy of Biden Harris. But what are your initial takeaways? What are you preening from the results, as it relates to energy?
Well, I think it's true what the president. First of all, it's awesome to be with you. And I hate we missed a personal catch up, but Zoom catch up is second best, but always a great opportunity. So I think what the president said is correct. The American people delivered a mandate and an overwhelming mandate. His vision of America First policies that he's been painting rally after rally after rally, this is what they want. They want him to prioritize investment here, growth, development here. And once we shore that up, to be willing to share that with the rest of the world, which a rising tide will lift all boats. That's always been the case in the past. And so I think broadly speaking, that is what the American people want to see. They want him to fix the economy, they want him to arrest inflation, and they want him to cut energy prices. One of the specific policy promises he said with respect to energy prices is that he wants to slash them by 50%. So I think that the American people, every time you go and fill up at the pump, every time you pay an electricity bill, they are feeling the effects of the IRA subsidies of the market signal this administration has been sending to oil and gas developers to suppress activity here. All of the things that impact what we ultimately pay at the pump. And the American people, I think they're more attuned to energy. They're more attuned that it's not just the price at the pump, but there's a whole ecosystem, if you will. I really do think people have been paying more attention. Fracking obviously was front and center in Pennsylvania, but people were paying attention. One of the last times I was on Fox News, Bill Hemmer did a full play-by-play of what exactly hydraulic fracturing is. And the reason he said he was doing that, before, as we're chatting before the show actually starts, is they've been getting so many requests for people to actually understand what hydraulic fracturing was. So all that being said, energy was, I think it was one of the top 5 issues that people were really voting on. The other ones I didn't touch on, obviously crime and immigration and derivative issues along those lines. But I think energy was a top issue. And so the president is going to make it a top priority coming in day one to fix in the ways that he's talked about throughout the past couple of years.
And for those who are just catching on to our conversation, I have some new listeners to the podcast too in recent months. They may not know that you were chief of staff at the EPA and you also held some other top advisory positions early on in the Trump administration. So you know exactly what you're talking about. You've been there. You've been in those rooms. You've had a seat at the table of energy policies, much like the other complementary agencies like Department of Energy, Department of Interior, which listeners know also handle these energy issues. But EPA also deals with these kind of more complex things like the EV mandate and air quality issues and all these other things. And people have become very familiar with the weaponization of the EPA. You guys were not weaponizing the EPA across your 4 years in office. So what do you think regulatory environment under a second Trump administration is going to look like? Is it going to be very similar to what you guys did in the first one, where for every new regulation, you repeal 8, 10 regulations? Is it going to be a deregulatory environment? And I think people, when they hear about deregulation, they get so scared and they're like, it's going to lead to a despoiling of the environment. And I've assured people through this show, through my work at IWF and just conversations, that deregulation does not lead to decimation. So I think what people misunderstand is if you have economic productivity and energy development, it's going to lead to this despoiling of the environment. That did not happen under Trump. We had record levels of clean air, clean water. We saw more people recreate on public lands, going to the ocean to boat and fish. So those things are not at odds with one another. But what does the regulatory landscape look like all the while with this maintenance of the environment, which a lot of the left doesn't like to think that we have, but we do see that
Yeah.
under even a energy abundant mindset.
Yeah, well, I think we have a great track record. And it's one I understand why new listeners may not be attuned to the great track record we actually had during the first 4 years of the Trump administration. We cut massive regulations. And ultimately, what that did, it was about $99 billion of direct expenditures on compliance, on direct expenditures, basically that went and fed the federal bureaucracy. We saved that from feeding the federal bureaucracy and feeding economic productivity. And how that manifests itself is certainly more workers and expansion, but investment in the latest and greatest technologies. There are so many manufacturers out there, or folks who are part of the any energy industry, any major manufacturing operation. You think of highly complex operations, they have access to new technologies, but in some instance, it costs more not to put the latest and greatest technology from a regulatory perspective than it does just to keep the same old outdated technology from operating as is. And so this is I'll dive a little bit wonky here. Permitting reform is a huge opportunity. Yes. And I do think that this will be a priority for the next Trump administration because it's so matter of fact. There's a program under the Clean Air Act. It's called New Source Review. People refer to it as NSR. People are going to throw it around all the time. But the effect of it is, I had a manufacturing operator tell me it basically takes $1 million investment or endeavor and turns it into $1 billion liability. And that's a problem. People aren't going to do that. At the end of the day, there's limited time, energy, and capital. And plus, investors are only going to have that sidelined for so long. So permitting reform is really important for cutting regulations that are ineffective. And this is really important to understand. When folks hear deregulation, that's not a bad word. The left, they went out of their way to paint it as a bad word. They're already doing it. There's already articles. I've seen them. Deregulation is actually a really good thing because it gets rid of the regulations that don't actually lend itself to improved tangible results, whether it's reduction in tangible air pollutants, cleaning up the water, addressing legacy pollution in the soil. So backing up to, if I had to define the biggest difference or the biggest shift from what we've seen under the Biden-Harris administration back to Trump 2.0, is a refocus on the agency's core mission, which is to protect public health and the environment. This means focusing on traditional pollutants. This is particulate matter, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, as well as improving industrial efficiencies through reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing methane emissions, carbon dioxide, and hydrofluorocarbons, and things along those lines. It's focusing on actually reducing those and not using some sort of long-term gap and being able to control them as a way to scare the public, and then weaponize the agency to go after industries and people that have fallen out of political favor, which is what has happened in the past 4 years. That's all going to fall by the wayside on day one. The other thing too, Gabby, and I think this is going to be a big difference from Trump round one to Trump round two, is that there are going to be a ton of structural reforms. So I've mostly been talking about the policy reforms. This is regulatory actions. This is even some minor staffing responsibility changes within the agency HQ in DC and the various regional offices across the country. But there's going to be some major structural reforms. I believe the president when he says Elon Musk is going to be in charge of something like the Department of Government Efficiency, where he's going to audit the agencies and he's going to deliver pink slips, if you will, to the offices and the roles that don't tangibly contribute to fulfillment of an agency's core mission, whether it's the FBI, whether it's the SEC, DOJ, DOI, any of them. So at EPA, I mean, there's a lot of recommendations I would have, but I think there's going to be major structural reforms. And it's going to be mislabeled. It's going to be characterized as we're gutting the government. We're doing away with some necessary function, but that's not true. If we're getting rid of it, it's doing away with a superfluous function that actually gets in the way of fulfilling the agency's core mission. So two words, the structural changes and shrinking the size and scope of the federal government is actually going to make it operate better. And then deregulating means getting rid of the regulations that don't actually work, but instead get in the way of tangible progress or economic development.
Viewers, listeners may not know, but on average, it takes 7 to 10 years for a project to fully come online with the existing permitting, lack thereof reforms that we have, which is unheard of. And I think we've seen even bipartisan consensus to move away from this. There's been gridlock on this end, and they finalized a so-called bipartisan permitting reform rule, which is not really bipartisan and not really for permitting reform. Speaking to straying away from mission statement, I have observed and noted here at the podcast and in my policy work that they have put climate ahead of conservation, or climate ahead of energy production or energy abundance. And that has started to affect their work. They had these people who were very controversial, who were tasked with spent nuclear waste fuel, recycling that. Others who were saying that, climate change is an unmitigated disaster and we have to accord by the Paris Climate Accords. And if we don't do it, everything's going to be at a standstill. But we haven't seen these so-called Paris Climate Accord goals be met. And actually, even the UN and others who are going to disagree with what we're talking about here, and they're really nervous, actually. Their net zero goals will never be met. Yeah, absolutely. So their net zero goals will not be met. And I think people had seen this with other areas too, like especially in the environmental front, the ESG platitudes that were starting to creep into all different agencies, the SEC, the Department of Labor, which was one of the first to implement an ESG-like thing. And then you had unofficial, or rather mandated by the executive order, one of Biden's early executive orders, basically stating everything has to accord with ESG. So we even saw the Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior, reorient their mission statement to say, well, climate comes before wildlife management. I even heard left of center conservationists say this is really hamstringing us and our ability to have conservation. So you might even see some middle of the road center left people saying this is a relief. We're going to get back to the mission. And I think people will be welcoming that with the Trump-Vance administration, because it really isn't leading to any measurable benefit to the environment. Like you and I have talked about this. And one thing people forget under your tenure at EPA, you guys did Superfund cleanups, and even Politico and some left of center environmental news outlets were saying Trump actually got his EPA and his other environmental agencies got Superfund cleanups correct. They gave a concession saying that you guys did this, unlike President Obama and some of the other predecessors. So there were some notable environmental achievements, which really stunned even your harshest critics.
Yeah, that's right. And Gabby, you'll appreciate this. Just a few days ago, there's a group of moms that have really organized at this one particular Superfund site that's outside the Chicago area. As soon as President Trump won, she texted me and said, please get our Superfund progress back on track. And what's essentially happened is we had immense progress, and this really is a testament to a gentleman named Kel, who was hired to head the Superfund program. He isn't an environmentalist. He was a businessman from Oklahoma, very good friends with the first administrator, Scott Pruitt. But Kel came in. He was in charge of the Superfund program, turning it back on. And all he did was apply a business-like approach to the Superfund program. And it was let's produce tangible progress instead of perpetual process. That was the defining line and a good way to think about it. And Superfund, just for folks who may not be as familiar, these are the most polluted sites across the country, a legacy of our past, not a past we're going back to. The left will try to tease people or scare people into thinking that deregulation means we're going back to the past. That's absolutely not true. But prior to, I would say that the 1970s, when there was this culmination in this movement of environmental protections, industrial actors didn't really have standards. They didn't think about the environmental impact. People didn't understand environmental degradation and what happens when you release certain things. And as a result, there are some of the most there are some very polluted soils all around the country. So if you rise to a certain level, that area is put into the Superfund program. It's actually a death knell for the surrounding communities, because you can imagine it just got the value of the land, it got the value of any development. And then typically these areas, they've been riddled with some sort of disease or problem if there were people living in these very polluted areas. Because now we understand all this. Nonetheless, this program's been around for quite some time. So if you can turn it back on, it has a huge impact, because it's not just about cleaning up cleaning up the past pollution, which is really important, but it gives these communities a whole new mandate on life. People are willing to come in and actually make investments. And when we were during the first round, and I think this would be something that would be attractive in the second round, is pairing up Superfund sites with opportunity zones. Remember, opportunity zones were areas that were depressed economically. If you were an investor and you went and you built a facility in an opportunity zone, there were all sorts of tax breaks and incentives to encourage that type of investment. And so if you have a Superfund site that gets cleaned up and it's in or near or partially a part of an opportunity zone, it is a recipe for environmental success while creating new, amazing economic opportunity. And we were able to couple that in a couple of key places. I really think a focus would be turning that on overdrive during this next go round.
I didn't hear that floated before, but that actually is a brilliant strategy. And it also reminds me, similarly, I think the EPA did handle a little bit of this, and maybe Department of Energy and Interior, but the rehabilitating of former coal fields, whether that's into wildlife habitat or even into nuclear facilities. So repurposing land or areas that were previously, maybe environmentally despoiled, or perhaps they were in a productive use and maybe they're moving into, a different kind of conservation use or another energy use. Seeing that repurposing, we did see a lot of that happen under the Trump administration. So I think you're right that we could see that happen. And similarly, even though the EPA doesn't necessarily handle let's say nuclear, that's under more so the
NRC.
It's under that, and also the Department of Energy. But something that everyone has been talking about, I've seen people on the right and the left get very excited about this over the summer. Everyone has talked to, and in early fall, 3 Mile Island coming back on. All these different tech companies now going fully on board nuclear and also natural gas because they've realized that solar and wind cannot adequately supply electricity to power data centers. Although I hope nuclear facilities aren't only relegated for data centers. It should be for all types of electricity uses, not just for that, but it could be used for that if done smartly, and also not tied to the IRA, because I did see some stories that they are getting a little bit of IRA kickback. So I hope it's fully vested in the private sector. So do you think, even though you work for EPA, but there's a lot of overlap with energy and interior, do you think we're going to see more nuclear coupled with, of course, the promises of permitting reform, cutting regulation? Do we see more nuclear energy facilities coming online during a Trump administration? Is he going to fully unleash it and encourage private investment more so than like propping up the IRA to keep these facilities functioning or to prop them up entirely? What is your view into nuclear's future under Trump?
Yeah, I think it has a great and a very bright future. And the technological developments leading up to this moment in time where you're going to have a president who does want to either balance or prioritize private sector investment versus government subsidy reliance. That's not the way to go. We need to cut that as much as possible. And he's very much committed to that as well. But I think nuclear is an amazing opportunity because, as you rightfully point out, it has a broad reaching momentum. You have current environmentalists, former environmentalists, coupled with conservationists, anyone who wants to practically talk about creating a future where future energy growth is met in a reliable and affordable way while continuing to reduce emissions overall. Nuclear is obvious answer. And there's been some amazing technological breakthroughs, small modular nuclear reactors, molten rock nuclear reactors. There's all sorts of different technologies. I'm not going to pretend like I know all of them. But I have some very, very smart friends who've been working in the nuclear fusion fission. There's been some breakthroughs on that as well. And all of this being said, President Trump loves innovation. He will prioritize innovation. He talks about it all the time. And he trusts the geniuses and the tinkers of this country to do what they do best to help us collectively solve problems. So much like he did in Trump round one, but more effectively in Trump round two, he's going to prioritize that. And again, I think having someone like Elon Musk a part of that really tight-knit inner circle, it's really important. And it's not just Elon, it's the sector of society that he represents, all of these really smart, highly intelligent tech bros, if you will, and tech ladies. But all of those folks, the Silicon Valley folks that really solidified the internet age and gave us all the modern amenities we appreciate through our phones and apps and connecting online, all of those things. Those people now will be a direct line resource to the president by virtue of his relationship with Elon Musk. And I think that that has such immense potential, especially for things that have been on the technological cutting edge, like nuclear energy. But anyone who's willing to have a practical conversation about energy, nuclear has to be front and center. And the president has certainly been very practical about energy for a long time. He obviously wants to unleash liquid gold, as he said when he accepted the nomination, or accepted the presidential nomination at around 3 a.m. Eastern time on, I guess that was technically Wednesday morning, but nonetheless, it's an all of the above, but nuclear and getting the NRC to reduce the regulatory landscape, not in a way that sacrifices safety, but in a way that develops progress in allowing these technologies to actually be used and proliferate responsibly across the U.S.
Well, two entities that viewers and listeners will look out for, or should look out for, that maybe propped up more during the Trump administration. One is Oklo, which is actually a now publicly traded private nuclear company. They build these like ski chalet small modular reactors, and they're like women who are skeptical of nuclear and need something visually, aesthetically pleasing and a way to be convinced about nuclear's potential. Their prototypes are gorgeous. Like, it's so beautiful, and I hope we can see some innovation like that. They've tried to work with Department of Energy. They've met some roadblocks, but people are very optimistic. And Sam Altman is on their board of directors, I think, the big open AI guy. So we'll see that. And then also the nuclear company, which is run by Mark Barons, I think, or Energy Bents. I forget, his name is Mark, but he's a pretty good nuclear evangelist. We're going to have him on the podcast soon. And he started this kind of pipeline to match people who work in nuclear, whether it's policy, engineering, what have you, into nuclear energy jobs. So we're going to see those two entities, I think, maybe elevated and propped up more during a Trump administration, and definitely, hopefully, more privately led investments and also private companies really coming to the forefront, and then hopefully not dooming their potential with IRA subsidies, because you and I both agree, and I think a lot of us in kind of the energy space that we travel in have seen what the IRA has done to solar and wind. And those sources I have become very opposed to from a utility scale perspective. I think if not backed by subsidies, maybe, but they can't be scalable. They're not scalable, and they've been doomed because government has been propping them up unsustainably through the IRA. If the IRA is made permanent, I don't see that happening under a Republican trifecta. It's going to cost the taxpayers $1.8 trillion. And that's my worry with nuclear, that if it gets hamstrung by federal spending, it could be doomed like that. But I don't think that's going to happen under Trump. And Mandy, since you kind of have a lay of the land, you talk to a lot of people, your name has been floated as possibly coming back to the EPA, possibly succeeding your former boss, Andrew Wheeler, as administrator at EPA. I think you have said in different quotes that you're happy being back in Mississippi, but you wish, the administration success. Maybe you'll have some sort of consultation role. But what do you see your involvement being, and who do you think is going to take over EPA, or rather administer EPA, run EPA? Is it going to be your former boss, Andrew Wheeler? Is it going to be Virginia Natural Resources Secretary Travis Boyles? His name has been floated as an option too. So if not you, who's going to be leading EPA?
Yeah, I actually think Andrew Wheeler would be amazing. I don't know if he wants it, but to the extent he does and is given the opportunity, I would throw my support 110% behind him. The truth is, we had a whole second term agenda already laid out and ready to go, and obviously didn't get the opportunity to implement that. He's a great leader. He's been confirmed before. He has a great rapport with the civil servants that are willing to do their job, but he's also very effective, clear-eyed, and has a great rapport with the president. So I think he would be great to lead it again. And there's always that thing about unfinished business. It doesn't sit well with the soul. So I hope he gets the opportunity, and if he wants it, I will support him in that. The truth is, we have an amazing bench of environmental experts. I don't want to throw a lot of names around because you mentioned one name, and then the DC reporter class, they all flutter towards that person immediately. But I will say this: I worked with in the development of a lot of various projects, including Project 2025. I wrote the EPA chapter for the Heritage Foundation. I tapped into the vast, diverse network of environmental experts that we have that are committed to a more conservative EPA, small c conservative. So that means a smaller but better functioning entity to actually deliver tangible improvements to the air, water, soils, and industrial expansion that is required. There are so many different people. I do not personally want to go back. I've got young children, and for the next 4 years, it's kind of those sweet, precious years before they start leaving the house. I don't want to miss that, but I do care greatly about these issues. There's all sorts of ways that I can help. My mantra is I'll be a better cheerleader than chief. And I will cheer, consult, console, direct, strategize, whatever. But from Oxford, Mississippi, occasionally going up to help out my DC friends. That's how I see my role going forward during this administration.
I mean, you'll be affected. If they don't consult you, it would be a grave mistake, but I have no doubt they will, consult you, seek you out for that. And like you, I was part of the Interior Project 2025 chapter. I didn't write it, but I sat in on calls and I was part of that New York Times expose. And I really think they did make a big stink about it because they have a Project 2021 right now, currently in effect under Biden Harris. Everyone does this, right, left. These are just policy papers. And I think assigned a lot of like extremism to it where there was not much. And these are like typical conservative Republican positions on energy and conservation issues. And some of them are kind of lofty, but if we have, people who were previously in charge going to be in charge again, it's not going to be, this selling off of public lands or despoiling of the environment as the critics of Project 2025 have made it out to be. I purposely sat in on Department of Interior calls for Project 2025 to make sure like we can't do anything that would, irk people. We can have some discussion about how should public lands be managed. We want to keep the multiple use mandate, but a full wholesale transfer, Trump never did that. And if he were to do that, it would anger a lot of people out west. And so we want to have those debates, policy debates, even among the center right, to make sure we have good policy, that everyone is happy, things of that sort. But I want to finish off our conversation, I think, on a positive note. You had written a book. We had tried to connect on this, but I want you to talk about your book stemming from your experience in DC, policy fights, all that. It's called Y'all Fired. I want you to use the last few minutes we have together to talk about the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so it's called Y'all Fired, A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. And yeah, there's three main portions. The first is my experience with the deep state. They are a mean, catty bunch. So anyone who's listening that may be thinking about going back in, just be prepared. Someone's going to stab you in the back. It's going to suck. And if you need to cry, give me a call, or you need to go for a jog or whatever. Find ways to take the negative energy you're definitely going to get when you walk into those agencies, shed it, and get back to the positive work that's going to be before you. But that's step one. So it's my anecdotal experience. Just to put a little context to this, the worst is when I went to negotiate on behalf of the president after we got out of the Paris Climate Accord. I was a huge part of that.
You were the chief architect of our withdrawal. Don't be shy.
To figure out if there was a better path, and you really wanted to renegotiate the terms so it was good for America and it shared what we do best, which is our innovative technology. I went to the climate conference later that year. This was 2017. It was in Bonn, Germany, and I had earned a lot of enemies in the State Department, in particular the climate subdivision. And anyway, the way that they harassed me when I got to Bonn is they put me in a sex hotel 45 minutes away from where the actual negotiations were occurring.
What? So I didn't know this.
Oh yeah. So it was pretty, it's a pretty crazy, wild story. And when you're a federal employee, your logistics are handled by a team of people. I'd been a federal employee before. I'd been in the Senate for many years, so I was used to this process. I didn't think about having to fine tune or check it. I was actually more excited because I was officially part of the administration delegation instead of being part of the Senate delegation. And so I get there, I go, I show up, I'm ready to do the work. And it's just everything that could go wrong goes wrong. And it was by design. It was a very clear message from those that I'd pissed off by virtue of my support in President Trump getting out of the Paris Climate Accord, that they were going to do what they could to demean, demoralize, and discredit me personally and any of the work and policies that I supported. And they delivered that. Very clearly. Gabby, I'll text you some of the pictures after this. It's pretty crazy.
It's nuts. Yeah, for sure.
It's so that's an example. I mean, I want anyone who's going in, you got to have a thick skin and just keep your head on a swivel. Hopefully the structural changes will get rid of a lot of that vindictive, superfluous fluff. But there's going to be some people there that have lots of tools to try to make your life unnecessarily complicated and unnecessarily difficult. So just be ready for it. That's one example. The other example is a few months ago, I had 2 FBI agents and someone from the EPA IG's office show up, deliver me a criminal subpoena after my name had been floated as potential EPA administrator. Again, there's nothing there, but they are using, or they have been using, investigatory processes as a weapon against people that they politically don't like or politically want to discredit. So all that, fast forward. The second part of the book, this is the wonky. If you're a wonky person, you'll like the middle. This is a deep dive into the history of how did we get to this place where the unelected bureaucrat is has more sway than the American voter. That is not how our constitutional republic was actually designed to operate. And 2 things really quick there. I go back to passage of the 16th and the 17th Amendment. 16th was income tax. 17th was how we elect our senators. The overarching takeaway is this really shifted resources and relevance away from the states and towards Washington, D.C., that I think broke down really important checks and balances that created a pathway for the New Deal administration to come in and really expand the administrative state, where voters start looking to the U.S. government to solve their problems instead of the good old American way of how can I figure out how to solve this for myself or help my neighbors who are closest around me. So I do a pretty deep dive. It's pretty wonky, but I think it's really interesting. I learned a ton. And then the last part is, what do we do? And I'm really excited about this because President Trump's obviously won. You have Elon Musk, who's going to be in charge, presumably, of the Department of Government Efficiency or whatever they call it. But I have some tangible steps that can be taken. Structural changes. This has to do with the budget. I really think the first budget that we put out, this is why the balance of the House is going to be so important. But the first budget we put out, it should cut every single agency by 30% across the board. You could do that, and this country would function better. The missions of the agency would be better fulfilled. And so I lay out ways to do that, ways to think about it. And then also there's some technical options. This administration has things like Schedule F, which restores accountability within certain levels of the federal workforce. Again, if you work in the regular world, if you don't do your job, you could lose your job. If you're in the federal government, it doesn't matter, you get promoted anyway. And if anyone comes after you, you try to make them out like a crazy person. So we want to fix that. And so there's some policy suggestions that could be instituted as well. Also relocating some of the core functions out of DC to the rest of the world. I think there's an opportunity, Department of Interior and a lot of the federal Western lands issues. Just making sure that key regulatory functions are closest to those that they impact. That lends itself to better workforce diversity. You have people who are from the areas impacted who have that specialized wisdom, whether they grew up and they know the land or they studied out there, things that geographically or colloquially actually matter in the realm of environmental work or conservation. I think that's going to be really important. So there's an opportunity for massive reforms that at the end of the day delivers a leaner, meaner agency operation that delivers taxpayers benefits to the taxpayers, but most importantly, restores the role of the American voter over that of the unelected, unaccountable bureaucrat.
That is well said. And I will include every link to connect with Mandy, get her book, everything of that sort. Mandy, thank you so much for the update. I think a lot of your foresight and predictions will come true, and it'll be very interesting to watch what happens with environmental policy under Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, thanks, Gabby, for having me.